It's time to get your music radio ready with the Audio Skills Podcast. It doesn't matter what type of music you're creating or what gear you use. It's all about the technique. Get ready to turn your home studio into a place where your music goes platinum. Now give it up for your host, Scott Hawksworth.
Hey, how's it going, everyone? Scott back with you, bringing you a new episode of the Audio Skills Podcast. We have just a fantastic show for you today, where I'm going to be joined by the brilliant Ian Shepherd to talk all about mastering. But first, before diving into all that, it's time for your audio tip of the week. My audio tip is this: remember that you can't polish a turd. Okay, that's a little crass, but the philosophy behind it is sound. If you are going to be mastering, you shouldn't have to do things that can be fixed in the mixing phase. If the mix is terrible, you're going to have a very tough time making it suddenly sound great in the mastering phase. If you're mastering your own music, that means it's time to go back to the mixing phase if you're really unhappy with the sound or you've got a lot of problems still. If you're mastering someone else's music, it gets a little trickier. If you need the work, you just have to do the best that you can, unfortunately. But if you can swing it, don't be afraid to tell an artist or your client, hey, I'm sorry, but there are a lot of problems with this mix, and can you give it another pass? Whatever you decide to do, I highly, highly recommend that you address any issues and problems in the mixing phase and leave mastering for that final polish. And that's your audio tip of the week. So now I am very happy to introduce Ian Shepherd, mastering engineer, owner of the excellent production advice website, co-host of the Mastering Show podcast, founder of Dynamic Range Day, and basically all-around mastering guru. Ian, welcome to the show, man.
Hi, Scott. Thanks.
How are things going for you as we turn the page to December? You gearing up for the holiday season? Any big plans?
We Christmas tree this weekend. The main thing that jumped into my head is that it got really cold, like today. You know, like it's been kind of chilly here, but nothing serious, and it kind of just got really bitingly cold. But not as cold as a client of mine who reached out for some technical help and is in Oslo. I have no idea how cold it actually is there, but it's going to be a lot colder than it is here. So yeah, it's good.
Right on, right on. Well, to start us off, could you just tell us a little bit more about your career in audio and just the things that you're working on today?
Sure. So I've been a professional mastering engineer for well over 20 years now. It must be 22, 23 years. I basically went straight into that out of college, pretty much. That's pretty unusual. You know, most people go to mastering after they've been recording engineers or mixing engineers or whatever. But I applied for a job, and at the time I thought it was just a tape duplication plant, but actually, unknown to me, it was one of the leading independent CD mastering facilities in the UK, and they basically trained me from the ground up. So. Yeah, I've been doing that ever since. I mean, I've done other stuff along the way. I've done some recording. I've done some mixing. We were kind of in one of the first places in the UK to do enhanced CDs, where you put QuickTime videos onto. You had a CD that also had a little bit of CD-ROM data on the end of it, so you could play the music in the CD player and play the CD-ROM. And then we kind of moved on from that to DVD, and then I moved on from that to Blu-ray later on, and now I do the website. I still do mastering work, and I'm developing the plugins. So yeah, that's the short version.
Right on. So definitely a lot of experience there. And on today's show, we obviously want to talk about mastering. And the first thing that often comes up and questions I get from my listeners, my subscribers is, inside the box mastering versus outside of the box. And, there's a lot of, I've seen some debate, some claiming that one is 100% better than the other. Where do you fall on that? Can you get great results mastering entirely in the box, or is it outside of the box is the way to go and you're a noob if you just focus on inside the box? Where do you fall on that, Ian?
I think it's a bit of a red herring, to be honest, the whole question. I mean, there's I mean, there's no question you can get great results in the box and out of the box. I default to working in the box. That's how I was trained. 22, 23 years ago, digital mastering was the new big thing. Everybody wanted to have that DDD symbol on their CD that meant it was recorded, mixed, and mastered digitally. That kind of sounds weird these days, but that was the case. So, yeah, that was the way that I was trained, and that's kind of still my instinct. But I mean, it's great to have a really nice piece of analog hardware, and I've done it both ways. I've got great results both ways. There are people who swear that they can't get the results that they want without the particular analog EQ or compressor. That hasn't been my experience. I can't think of a time when I wasn't able to get a result that I was happy with using a digital chain. Which is not to say that I wouldn't be happy to use analog stuff as well. So, yeah, I think there are much more important things to worry about. If you have access to sexy analog gear and you enjoy using it, then do. But if not, don't let that make you think, oh, I can't do this. I mean, there are so many other... Mastering is hard enough without kind of giving us... People even agonize about which plugins they have or which analog EQ it should be,
Yeah.
And I think all of that is beside the point as well. My kind of... I teach an online course called the Home Mastering Masterclass, and the unofficial catchphrase of that is, it ain't what you use, it's the way that you use it. And I genuinely believe that. I think, because you can never test this stuff exactly. Even if you gave the same engineer the same song to master and you gave them a completely digital chain and a completely analog chain, I'm sure when you came to the end of that, the results would be very similar, because it's the engineer's vision of what is needed for the song that drives what they do with the gear, right? There would be subtle differences between them, and different people might have different preferences for each. But I've yet to discover a magic ingredient either way, that you couldn't get so close to that most people wouldn't be able to tell the difference. So I think a lot of it comes down to preference. And yeah, I think don't worry about it. Sort out the monitoring, learn how to balance levels, all these other things that maybe we can talk about. Just like people agonize over converters, and that kind of stuff. I mean, the speakers that you use and the room that you're in and whether or not you have any acoustic treatment are going to make a massive difference to the results that you get. Whereas your choice of hardware, providing you've got a certain minimum level of quality and kind of features, is going to make maybe a 1%, maybe a 5% difference, perhaps. Whereas it could be, like a 50% difference or something if the room's not set up right, or you don't have enough acoustic treatment, or the speakers aren't right. So yeah, much more important things to worry about.
Absolutely. And I really love that. And that's the kind of philosophy I try to have, even with, mixing and things like that there are great tools out there. There's great analog tools. There are great plugins, but wrapping so much up into, well, if you don't have this plugin or you don't have this piece of gear, you're just not going to get a good result. That's a pretty deflating thing to believe. And I just think it's not true.
Yeah, I agree. I think anybody who says that kind of go, okay, and move on. I think, use the gear that you have and be happy with it. There's Andrew Sheps is a mix engineer who's now 100% in the box. There's more and more engineers going in the box. I think Michael Brower is doing a lot of his stuff pretty much in the box these days. Jonathan Weiner, who now works at Isotope, his mastering system is 100% in the box, I believe, now. As I say, I think it's just a red herring.
Absolutely. So, okay, before going any further, I have to ask you about the Loudness Wars. It's something that you've very much led the charge against for years. And my two questions are, one, with normalization on many platforms, are the Loudness Wars over? I've seen a lot of people try to declare them dead. Is that true? And then two, can you tell us a bit about Dynamic Range Day and what that's all about?
Okay. Well, if I start with Dynamic Range Day, the idea of that was just to raise people's awareness of this issue, right? So I'm sure everybody listening to this knows the issue is everybody wants their stuff louder and louder. Everybody thinks they have to be loud in order to compete, in order to sound right, all of this stuff. And we're at the point now where lots of music is so loud that the quality is suffering, and it would be better if it wasn't so loud. So Dynamic Range Day is just an online event every year, usually the end of March, where I try and raise awareness of that by getting people to post stuff. We post memes online. Sometimes I do a webinar that people can join into. In the past, we've had competitions. There's an award that I give to the best sounding dynamic album of the last year, in my opinion, and the people who send in suggestions. So yeah, it's just about making lots of noise, about loudness, basically. The irony of all of this, and I would definitely say that it's still needed, because people tell me it's still needed. People want me to keep doing it, and that's because I don't think the war is over. I think the war has been won because of loudness normalization, which I'll talk about in a second. But I think people are still fighting the battle. I think the message hasn't got through to the troops. It's because the point about normalization, so normalization is used in media players like iPods and MP3 players, and online, and also actually by broadcast, by radio and TV. And it's basically the number one source of complaints from users, people who listen to music, is when the loudness changes suddenly and unexpectedly. People hate a song disappearing and they're not being able to hear it because it's too quiet, and they hate being blasted by a loud song that comes afterwards.
Sure.
So to fix that, manufacturers and the streaming services are basically trying to even out the loudness. So they have software that measures as best it can the loudness of each song and makes them more consistent wherever it can. And they use different methods to do that, and they have slightly different levels. But what that means is it doesn't matter when you listen online, or if you listen on an MP3 player where somebody has this feature enabled, or if you listen on radio and TV, how loud the song was originally when you mixed or mastered it, because it'll get played back at a similar level to everything else. So you have this crazy situation where people are pushing the levels harder and harder and harder onto CD or into an MP3 file, and then it gets turned down later on. So nobody ever hears the sort of inverted commas, the benefit of that.
Right, yeah.
All they hear is the problems that you might have caused in the process of getting it that loud. And that's why I say the war has been won, because, the war used to be, I want to get louder than everybody else so that I can stand out from the competition. First time I remember really hearing about it seriously was about the time that CD jukeboxes came out, right? There were these huge CD players that you could load 100 or 200 CDs into. And they would be used. I knew somebody who had one in his house, which he loved. He could call up anything. It's like, these days it seems kind of weird that everybody has an iPod where they can listen to anything they want whenever they want. But this was a novel thing for him. And also he could shuffle his entire music collection, which he loved. People used to use those in bars and pubs as well. And that was where maybe there was an advantage if your song was louder, because it would just cut through the background noise a little bit more, catch people's attention. They're going to go, oh, I love this song. That was, that's the kind of the driving force behind it. Trouble is that doesn't work anymore, because all of these places that use these playback systems, the MP3 players and streaming platforms, all the rest of it, even out the loudness. So you make your song super loud to try and make it stand out, and it doesn't. And in fact, it could actually stand out less, because the process of squashing it to get it up against that maximum level of a digital file,
right?
You take away some of the contrast.
Yeah.
You take away some of the punch and the impact of life and the space of it. And those are all things that, when you've got the loudness evened out, can actually make it stand out. So people are kind of doing the opposite to what I would recommend they do to make their music stand out. And yeah, the war kind of, it's not so much that it's been won, it's just there's no point to it anymore, because, maximizing the loudness isn't going to help you. So we're in this weird situation where the old way of doing stuff doesn't work anymore, and people haven't realized and have not yet changed their habits. And you also have this weird thing where some people have realized, but they're not quite getting it right. So I noticed that the last few Taylor Swift songs, singles, have been just as squashed on the CD as her previous releases. But when you look at them online, they've actually been turned down to be similar to so I'm thinking of YouTube in particular, right? If you look at it on YouTube,
right.
YouTube plays most stuff at about minus 13, minus 14 LUFS. And a LUF is a loudness unit, LUFS it stands for. But so the level is minus 14. Taylor Swift stuff has been uploaded at minus 16. And the weird thing about that is that because YouTube doesn't turn anything up, even though it was mastered super loud for the CD, it sounds a couple of dBs quieter than it could have done online. And if they'd uploaded it at full level, it would have got turned down automatically by YouTube. I mean, they still wouldn't have had any advantage by being loud, but it would actually have ended up a dB or two, sounding a dB or two louder than it actually does. So that's this kind of weird situation where, like, you know, the ends of the chain are not connected. The person who mastered it didn't realize that they could have gone a bit quieter and it would still have sounded as loud. And the person who uploaded it knew that it was going to get turned down and kind of did it in advance. And it's just crazy. It's a bit of a mess, to be honest.
Yeah, so people are still not quite figuring it out, even though the war has been over. There's still people fighting battles.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's why dynamic range day is important. Is I think most people know about this issue now, but I think the really interesting thing is that kind of a few years ago I would talk about this stuff and people would go, "The loudness what? I'm not quite," they didn't get it. Now you talk about it and they know exactly what you're talking about. And I'm actually seeing questions come up every day online, more and more often. How loud should I master my music for online delivery? So it's great that people are engaging with the issue, but they're kind of missing the point, which is you don't have to master at any specific level. You want to be loud enough so that you can make maximum use of the space that they give you. But there's no point in going any louder, because it'll just get turned down afterwards. So it's like everything else. I keep talking about the loudness sweet spot. It's what I find when you're just mastering for creative purposes, right? If you just do what's best for the music, things do sound better when they're louder, and the process of making them louder, there are benefits to that. And one of them is that that's the best way to hear EQ, is to get the loudness right first and then address the EQ, in my opinion. Rather than the other way round. So there are benefits to getting the loudness up there, but once you go too far, it gets worse. And that's what I mean by the sweet spot. You want it loud enough, but not too loud. And exactly the same thing applies for the streaming services. And actually the numbers even agree. So the numbers that I have thought for 10 or 15 years work really well for mastering music also work really well for streaming loudness. And of course, that's because they chose those numbers to work for a wide range of music. So something like, I think Tidal uses a level of minus 14 LUFS as well. And a friend of mine, Elko Grimm, just recently did some research that shows that works for 87% of the music out there, or 87% of the music in the Tidal catalogue. And the rest of it tends to be jazz and classical, where people are less concerned about loudness in the first place. So, it's all working out there. The technology is in place. The solution is there. People genuinely can just master their music to sound good these days and just not get kind of obsessed with the whole loudness thing. And that's the message that I want to try and get out to people, so that people can do the right thing for their music and make it sound better, which is the goal.
Absolutely. So, okay, though, now having said that, we still get these questions. I get this question all the time. People want their music to be they want their music to be loud. They want their mixes to be loud, as be competitive, as it were. Their mixes, their masters. And so they say, how can I get my music louder? But at the same time, keeping in mind, not going over that point where it starts to, not be beneficial and be detrimental to it. So my question for you, Ian, is, do you have any advice for building a reasonable amount of loudness into a master without overdoing it? Are there techniques or general strategies that can be helpful?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of sides to this. I mean, one thing I would say is that there's a difference between sounding loud and just being loud. And what I mean by that is, being loud is where you measure it on a meter and it says that your song is loud. You can actually do that with a quiet song and it'll still sound like a quiet song, right? Because it was performed softly and gently. If you take an gentle acoustic ballad, you can crank the loudness on it so that it's louder than heavy metal.
Yeah.
It won't actually sound loud because it was performed quietly, right?
Right.
So there's more to sounding loud than just being loud. So I think there are lots of things that people can do. Careful use of compression and limiting and distortion. Careful use of dynamic contrast. Gain staging in the mix. All of those kind of things can be used to build a loud sound, regardless of what the level meter says. But in terms of actually setting the levels, I can kind of give some concrete advice there. And there's actually a blog post where I go into this in more detail. Maybe you could include that in the show notes.
Absolutely.
It's off from memory. It's productionadvice.co.uk/how-loud. If anybody wants to try it out. But yeah, I can summarize it. And that is, first thing you need to do is get hold of a loudness meter. So measuring loudness used to be tricky, but these days there's an internationally agreed standard. So any meter that measures LUFS is what you need. Lots of DAWs have them built in now. I think Logic has one. I'm pretty sure the latest version of Cubase has it. Pro Tools has it. But if not, there's a whole range. You can get the super professional ones or you can get free ones. That they all do a good job.
Right.
The confusing thing about loudness meter is it measures 3 different types of loudness. There's the momentary loudness, which varies very, very quickly, tracks the loudness really fast. There's the integrated loudness, which measures the overall loudness of pretty much anything. Could be a song, could be an album, could be a TV program. So that's a long-term measurement. The one that I like is the short-term loudness, because it's not super fast, but it does give you kind of a real-time impression of the loudness of your music. And my advice to people is, at the loudest points of a song or the loudest point of an album, don't let the short-term loudness go above -9, -10. And I should couple that with a piece of advice, which is that I recommend you keep the peak level at -1. That's to avoid problems when you encode to MP3, and also because it's part of the iTunes standard. So it's just a kind of a technical thing. So if you have a limiter or something controlling your final output level, set that to -1, and then keep the loudest moments -9, -10. That's going to be easily loud enough and competitive enough, especially, with the streaming services and the loudness normalization, all this stuff going on. But that's how I've mastered for years. And occasionally I get somebody asking me to turn stuff up, but, it's very rare. And then you just balance the rest of it by ear. Just as a rough guide, quite often you would find that the difference between a gentle verse and a full-on chorus, or maybe kind of, in a dance tune before you hit the drop, could be 3 or 4 dBs. That's kind of typical. It can be more, it can be less. But so, if you're watching the short-term loudness, you're kind of around the -10, maybe down -14, -16 in the quieter sections, you're going to be in the right ballpark. And then it all becomes about the sound. If you want it to sound loud, get the drummer to hit the drums hard, hit the chords hard on the guitar. Well, you'd be surprised how often people come to me and they go, I wanted this to sound really loud, but the drummer was kind of not playing that loud, and I can't quite get the quality I want. And at that point, you have to say, well, I'm going to do what I can. But it would have been much better if the drummer had hit the drums really hard originally, because that makes, a drum sounds different when it's loud than when it's hit hard than when it's hit softly. And so does a guitar. And brass instruments sound different when you play, singers sound different when they belt it out than when they're kind of crooning. So you need all of that stuff in there as well. Otherwise, all this level stuff is not going to help you.
Absolutely. Now, kind of, you were speaking about different plugins and things that can be helpful to folks as they're trying to hit those right loudness levels, hit those right numbers. You actually have a plugin called the Perception plugin that can help with folks trying to eliminate, loudness deception. Can you tell us just a bit more about it and how that might help someone?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, since I'm going to do a shameless plug, I should say that I have two plugins, one of which relates to the previous question. So the other plugin is called Dynameter, and it actually shows you how dynamic your music is in real time. So you have a bar that kind of, it gets smaller the more crushed the music is, and it gets wider the more dynamic it is. And it gives you, there are presets and guidelines to help you get a visual aid of when you're hitting that sweet spot. So, you can push it up into the orange, into the, maybe just tickle the red, and you'll be at that point that I was talking about with the no louder than -10. And if it gets kind of really dynamic, then it's purple and blues, and in between there's greens. So it's color coded. You can zoom in and out and scroll on it. So yeah, people might want to look at that if they want a bit of extra help getting the numbers right, if you like. Perception is a bit different because it's the whole thing about loudness, the reason the Loudness Wars happened really is this psychoacoustic effect. So it's not a real effect. It's something that happens somewhere in our ear and our brain. And what it means is that when you turn sounds up, we think we hear a little bit more treble and a little bit more bass. Yeah. It's also called the smile curve or the Fletcher-Munson curve. People have probably seen it. And so if you take, and I've done this in a live demonstration, if you play people exactly the same file, but one of them is just half a dB or maybe a dB louder than the other, most people don't pick it out and say, oh, one of them's louder. They just go, oh, I like that one better. And nobody knows quite why it is. I often say, it could be an evolutionary thing, right? It could be that, way back in the Stone Age, it was more important for our ancestors to pay attention to the saber-toothed tiger that was breathing down their neck than the one that was over there in the distance watching a herd of gazelles. So, sure. things that are close are likely to be more interesting or more dangerous. So we're designed to pay more attention to loud sounds. Nobody really knows, but it is a fact. What that means is you have to be really careful when you're comparing things, because, a great technique for getting better results in mastering in general, and in mixing for that matter, is to use reference tracks. You often hear people say, find the song, you want to sound like Metallica or Taylor Swift or Adele or whatever it is, or Skrillex, get one of their songs and compare it with your own song. You can do that, and that's a great technique or a great strategy. But the first thing you need to do is turn those songs down so that they're a similar level to your mix, because anything you hear that's been released will have been through the mastering process. And even if it wasn't a kind of super loud Loudness War track, even if it was mastered at quite conservative levels, in comparison to a mix, it's bound to be a few dBs louder, if not much more. And if you don't level match before, automatically it's going to sound bigger, it's going to sound brighter to you, even if actually your mix sounds just as good. So another helpful thing that people can do when they're trying to get their heads around all of this stuff is, put that loudness meter over the mix. And in this case, I would say maybe aim for look at the integrated loudness, because there's an overall value. And let's say your mix is kind of, -18, -16, something like that. That would be kind of typical and pretty good if you're not using a limiter on the output bus. If you pick Taylor Swift, the number for those songs are going to be mastered more like -8 integrated over the whole song. So that would be 10 dBs of difference. That song would be 10 dBs louder than your mix. So there's no way you can make a fair comparison between those two. So you want to turn the reference track down before you try and match the sound. The same thing happens when you're actually mastering, because pretty much all mastering, you make stuff louder. I do, even though I campaign on the Loudness Wars, it is a part of the process, is to get the loudness to the right place and then optimize everything else around that. Because if you think about it, if you don't do that, you're going to be in trouble. Let's say the song starts off and it's a bit quiet, you do some EQ and then you turn it up, you're going to hear more bass and treble than you did when it was quiet, and suddenly you're going to have to adjust the EQ, right? So it makes sense to get the loudness right first, and then think, okay, now the loudness is about right. How much bass and treble do I need? Or how many, maybe some other frequency jumps out at you, and maybe do I need any compression? Do I want some limiting? Do I want some saturation? All of those things, and then you listen again, and maybe the changes that you've made make it actually sound a little bit louder or softer. So then you tweak the level again, and you just kind of go round on that in loops on that process and hone in on the perfect value. That's my mastering process, basically, in a nutshell. The problem with that is when you're comparing the before and after. Because if let's say you've made your song 3 dBs louder, as soon as you hit bypass on all those mastering plugins, it's going to get quieter. So it's not going to sound as good, but you don't have any idea whether that's just because it's quieter or because actually your master really does sound better. So perception, as a mastering engineer, I learned really on, one of the most important skills is to learn how to balance the before and after when you're making your comparison. So I do all the mastering processing. It would sound a certain way, and then I would turn the mastered version down a little bit before I did the A/B comparison, so that you've got a fair comparison. You're making good judgments about, yeah, it really does sound better. And sometimes actually you would think, oh no, maybe I've overcooked it slightly. I'm pushing the compressor too hard or whatever. Perception does that automatically, because it's quite a tough skill to learn, and it takes quite a long time. So perception, you put one instance of the plugin before your mastering chain, you put another one afterwards, you let the music play for 5 seconds roughly, and then you can hit balance, and it will automatically loudness match before and after the mastering chain and allow you to bypass everything in that chain with sync compensation as well. So you can even use it with an external analog chain. So if you're working out of the box, it will work in that situation as well. So, which is really hard to do. If you we have two hands, so you can hit bypass on two pieces of analog hardware at the same time. But with this, you could have a chain of 4, 5, 6 pieces if you wanted to hit bypass, and it's loudness matched. So then you can make a really fair comparison of whether the changes you're making are doing what you hope they do, or whether actually it just sounded better because it was louder and you haven't done that much, or actually maybe even you're making things sound worse. So yeah, and that can be... It's really powerful. I mean, it surprised me. I came up with the idea and I developed it with Ian Kerr from Meter Plugs. But actually, when I got to use it, it surprised me how useful it was, even though I'd been mastering for 20 odd years. And in theory, I had all of this experience. It's still valuable. So I think it's helpful kind of whatever stage of the process you're at.
Absolutely. That's just an awesome, awesome tool. So, and you were kind of talking about a little bit about your process, but, so many people, I'm really curious to know, when you're mastering a song, what would you say your overall philosophical approach is? What are your goals when you are mastering a song, and someone who's either newer to it, or maybe they've been frustrated with their results, what kind of goals are you trying to achieve when you are mastering beyond just, obviously, make it a bit louder, as we said?
Yeah, I mean, making it louder is part of it, but it's much, much more than that. I mean, I think I could sum it up by saying that it's about making it sound the best that it can possibly be. So, mastering is the final stage. Typically, after this, you burn a master for the CDs, or it gets uploaded. There's no more chances. So you've got to make sure there are no faults in there. But you also, you want to make it fulfill its potential as best it possibly can. I think another kind of, to get an idea of what I mean by that, an important thing is to think that it's about balancing, not matching. Mastering kind of comes into its own when you can master a single song, but it doesn't mean as much as if you're mastering a group of them. So if you think about a classic example, let's think a band has spent maybe a year or two recording 10, 12 songs, maybe in different studios, maybe they went to different recording studios, or maybe they just, different people's home studios, or different setups. They might have had different engineers. Maybe they've got some live tracks in there. You're going to get a real variety of sounds across all of those songs. And one of the things that mastering can do is just bring all of those things together. So, it turns a collection of songs into an album, or a single, or a playlist. And I always think of it as kind of like finding the center of gravity of those songs, kind of finding a line that runs through. So everything works. The quiet songs are just quiet enough, but they're still loud enough that you can hear them. The loud songs hit you hard, but they don't sound, they don't kind of make you wince and want to turn it down. And then it's getting the tonal balance in between those songs right. So yeah, people ask me whether they can use, there are plugins that will match EQ. And I think those can be kind of useful as a research tool to kind of see, okay, how is the EQ that I have for my song different to this reference track that I'm using? But the goal isn't to match everything. The goal is to balance things. I would say, if you think about a kind of an old-fashioned set of scales, where you'd put weights on one side and the thing you were weighing on the other side, you can get weights that balance the rice or sugar or whatever it is you have on the other side of the scales, but they don't match that thing, right? Lead weights that you're using to measure the weight. That's a balance, not a match. And it's the same thing with songs. You don't want the level and EQ of a quiet ballad to match a full-on rock tune. You want them to balance perfectly so that they just have just the right amount of impact and just the right amount of, they get the right emotional response from the listener. So those are the kind of things that I have in mind when I'm mastering. Does that answer the question?
I think so. Absolutely. And you're right. And I want to emphasize this again. It is so much more than just loudness. And I think sometimes people make the mistake in thinking that that's all it is, oh, I just turn the levels up and that's what it is. It's much more than that.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's another point there's another kind of mistake that I sometimes see people make is to imagine that you can put one setting over an entire collection of songs and they would be mastered. So maybe you put a limiter on and you crank the level up by 3 dB and you're done, or you put a general EQ over. I mean, that kind of thing can be an improvement to the sound, but the core of it for me is optimized settings for every song. So it might be, this one needs a little bit more 60 hertz and a little bit less. We'll have a high shelf above 10K to pull things back a little bit. Whereas this one, there's a huge booming bass note at 100 hertz, so we'll take some of that out, and it needs much more compression and a lot more aggression in the upper mids. And the thing that amazes me about it still, even after all this time, is how much control you can feel like you have, even though you're only working with a stereo mix, right? Because mastering is typically just on a stereo files. In comparison to the flexibility you've got in a mix, you would think you couldn't. People kind of come to the session, they say, can you lift the vocal out a little bit? And of course, the answer is no, not really, because we don't have access to the channels within the mix. But actually, quite often, when you put a little bit of EQ in the right place, you can make it seem like you've lifted the vocal out. So it's kind of amazing how much control you can have, and also how much difference really small changes can make. Sometimes people bring stuff in and you listen to it, you think, well, that's pretty damn good. I don't know whether I really need to do anything to that. And they'll say, well, we're here, try it anyway. And then you get into it, and kind of 4 or 5 hours later, you come out the other end, and you maybe have only made like little level adjustments of 0.5 dB and tiny little EQ moves here and there. But the effect on the whole thing is huge. As much, what's the expression? The sum is greater than the whole of the parts.
Yes.
And I'm still kind of amazed by how effective that is. It's kind of why I love mastering, really. It's almost a bit mysterious, a bit magical. And it's a really satisfying thing to do.
Absolutely. Now, okay, speaking on this, I have to ask this question, especially because I think you had a recent episode of your podcast all about this, which is automated mastering and all these automated mastering services that are out there. And I'm curious, what are your thoughts on these services? Because I know, especially a lot of people who are, making music from home, they think, well, I want to just send this off to get this, automatically mastered, and then I get my track back and I'm happy. What do you think about it? And do you think it can coexist with, mastering engineers and that kind of thing? And is there a place for it? Is it better, worse? Where do you fall on it?
Great question.
Loaded question.
Great complicated question. I absolutely think it has a place, and I have no problem with it. In fact, after I did a video where I kind of showed how my master of a song compared with what Lander did with it years ago, and they then reached out to me and kind of were asking whether I'd like to get involved, and I was really tempted because it's a really interesting challenge. There is a lot of there's a lot of what you do in the mastering process that you can kind of, I wouldn't say make rules for, but definitely strong guidelines, about loudness and about EQ balance and all that kind of stuff. So I think but I just wish they wouldn't call it mastering, because that kind of sums it up for me. I don't feel that it is mastering. Mastering for me is the process of a mastering engineer, a person listening to a song, reacting to it on a technical level and, all the rest of it, following all those guidelines, but also on an emotional level. We were just talking about balancing songs within an album. I think we're a long way off a computer being able to go, oh, this is a tender ballad, so I'm going to just let that be a little bit less aggressive than the thing that follows it. They can kind of analyze it and go, oh, frequency content, this, that, and the other. But, we don't even have computers that can drive cars yet. I don't think we have computers that can perceive emotion. But they're definitely, they get surprisingly good results. on quite a lot of material. I think I would say they're a bit like the auto color function in Photoshop or a photo editing package. Sort of 6-7 times out of 10, you have one of your photos, you click the button, you go, yeah, that looks better, and you move on. It's not like, yeah, that looks the best it can possibly be. It's just, that's okay, that's good enough for me to put on Facebook or whatever. I think that's a really different process than getting the absolute best, getting the last 5-10% out of a piece of music or out of a picture. And I think the automated mastering systems, that's where they are. They're kind of, you can plug it in and maybe 7 or 8 times out of 10, you might get a result that's a bit better. The other 2 times, you're likely to get a result that's completely wrong.
Yes.
There are those photos where all the colors are a bit washed out and stuff, and you hope that it's going to sort it all out, and actually just everything goes super dark, or it's all just completely blown out, or yes, it gets brighter, but the colors look absurd. Everybody kind of, looks like they've been face painted or something. And I think the same thing happens with those automating mastering systems right now. I'm sure they'll get better, and they're super affordable and they're super quick. So I hadn't thought about it before, but I was listening to the guy who designed the ARIA website, the automated mastering system, and he was saying that people, because they would upload a song once, get it back, and think, oh, okay, and tweak it, and then upload it again, and just keep going around until they got the final result they were happy with. It never occurred to me that kind of feels weird to me as a mastering engineer. I mean, there is a process when you're actually doing the mastering of kind of, sometimes you go around in circles, and certainly there's kind of back and forth, and you might talk to the artist and stuff. But basically, when I hear a song, I have a vision for, I have an intuition for what the artist wanted to achieve, and I have a vision for how I'm going to get the song closer to that. That's my goal, is to make it so that the client is even happier with the end result. And I just aim for that, and I get as close as I can. But it's like all of these things. Who am I to say that people can't do that? If that works for somebody, people use them as kind of an idea of getting an idea of what a mastering engineer might do with them before they send them to an actual mastering engineer.
Sure.
So I think they're completely valid. There's a ton of different ways that you could use them, and if people want to experiment with them, I'd encourage them to do that. I mean, I will say that in every test that I've heard or been aware of, when the loudness is matched, the human masters have always won. So just recently I took part in I was kind of watching a poll that Kenny Joyer, this is what the episode of the podcast that you were talking about was talking about. He had a song, and he got 3 human engineers to master it. There was Stephen Slate, a guy from Sterling Sound, and John Longley mastered the song, and then he got it mastered by Lander, Aria, and Ozone, Isotope's piece of software. And then he loudness matched them, because they all came out with quite big differences in loudness, right? So like some of the masters were 2 or 3 dBs louder, and just like we were talking about before, that means when people first hear them, they would probably go, oh, well, the louder one sounds better. But when you
take away that bias,
you take away that bias. If you imagine that they had been uploaded to YouTube, or they were being played on Spotify, or listened to on Tidal or Pandora, if you even out the loudnesses and then you listen, I think I'm right in saying that like the human masters got maybe 75 or 85% of the votes in the poll. It was a massive preference for the decisions made by the humans in that case. And when I did mine, I thought I got a better result, and the feedback I got from people was the same. And Graham Cochran from the Recording Revolution, without me knowing, put me up against Lander, and also just a straight limiter. So he had his mix, and he just put it through a limiter to get it up to a similar level. And in that one, something like 70 or 80% of people preferred my master. It's not like they said it was perfect necessarily. Quite a lot of them said, oh, I'd kind of like it if it was halfway in between those two. And that's where kind of taste and preference comes into it. But yeah, in all of those examples, the humans beat out the machines, which, is what I would hope for.
That's still a significant result there. I think statistically significant.
It's none of these tests are completely scientific, But I think at the moment the humans are winning, and that's it's early days. But that doesn't mean people shouldn't kind of play around with this stuff if they'd like to, I'd say.
Absolutely. Well, my last question, very last question, and people, you can learn from your mistakes, and I think people, especially as they try to get better with anything, mixing, mastering, they always get down on themselves about, oh, I made a mistake or whatever. Um, I'm curious, someone like yourself who has been doing this for so long, what's the biggest mistake either you've made or you've seen made when mastering a track?
Well, if you leave aside the kind of just smashing the levels when you do the mix, so that it gets to the mastering engineer and it's already got clipping distortion or it's heavily all over compressed, all that stuff, and kind of technical faults like accidentally sending it in mono, or whatever, which I've used every so often you see. So there are two things that spring to mind. I'm going to tell you one that is a genuine, probably the biggest mistake I ever made as a pro engineer, and it's very simple. I put the wrong song on an album. And nobody noticed until it was in the shops. It was a compilation CD. I forget what it was. I think it was maybe kind of jazz funk stuff. Was in the first few years that I was working as a mastering engineer. It was an instrumental, in my defense. So I was compiling from CD. I had a stack of CDs, and I was basically just, it was what you call copy masters. So I wasn't doing any sound work. It was just compile these songs in the right order. And I accidentally skipped back one song further than I meant to after I'd been queuing up the CD player, and I didn't notice while I was listening. So, and from that, I learned a really valuable lesson of mastering, which is the most basic thing you have to get right is to have the right songs in the right order.
Right.
But that's not a terribly useful anecdote for people listening to this. So there's something else I think that was not maybe necessarily a mistake, but it's something that I think there's a valuable lesson in there. At one point, 5 or 10 years ago, I decided I needed to know how to use Pro Tools. I always used to use, so mastering software tends to be different. There was Sonic Solutions. There's a thing called Sadie. These days I use Wavelab. And I'd done a bit of work in Logic. I'd done a bit of work in Cubase, and I thought I need to, because I would go out into studios where people were recording either to, kind of work as an engineer or to be a consultant or whatever. And I thought it'd be good if I had a working knowledge of Pro Tools. So I got the most affordable copy of Pro Tools I could find, which came with, I think nowadays Pro Tools will run on pretty much any hardware. But back then you had to have either the Avid converters, or you had to have an MAudio sound card to go with Pro Tools. So I got an MAudio Transit, which was a tiny little USB sound card. I think maybe 60, 70 pounds, which is $100 perhaps, USB thing that you could plug in. And that allowed me to run Pro Tools. So I did what I did do, which is I did a test master, and I was kind of, okay, so figuring out how Pro Tools worked and plugging everything in. And I mastered this song, and I was pretty happy with the results. And then I took it, I burned a CD, and took it to play in the car and put it on, and I was like, well, that sounds terrible. The EQ was completely wrong. I was like, what's going on? I can't believe why, normally I would take stuff from the studio out to the car and it'd be like, yeah, that sounds pretty good. It was just another way of listening to the song, getting a fresh perspective, listening in a different environment. So I took it into took it home and stuck it on the hi-fi, and it sounded wrong there. And I plugged in my earbuds that I, use with my MP3 player, and it sounded wrong on them. And I was like, well, that's crazy. So I went back into the studio, and I figured I had to have a setting wrong. I exported it without the right settings or something. I listened to it. No, it sounded absolutely fine. And I don't know how long it took me to figure it out, but what I just ended up discovering was that the MAudio Transit sound card didn't have a flat frequency response. Let me figure out which way around it was. From memory, I think it had too much mid-range, right? So I was listening through this. I had to listen through this thing. I just used it so I could get Pro Tools running, but in order to hear anything, I had to listen through this little sound card. So I had the output of it plugged in to my normal mastering monitoring. And it was basically applying an EQ curve, and I think it had too much mids. So I was listening to that. I was thinking, okay, well, sounds a bit mid-rangey, so I'll add more bass and more treble. So then when I took it out and listened to it anywhere else, in comparison to what I normally did, the EQ was completely wrong. It sounded like it had way too much bass and way too much treble.
Yeah.
So, like I say, that's not exactly a mistake that I made, but it's definitely a valuable lesson that I learned. I mean, one lesson is, be a little bit suspicious of the hardware that you're using. I just assumed that any sound card would have as flat a frequency response as possible. And in this case, for whatever reason, MAudio had decided that there was going to be some coloration to this converter. And that fooled my ears when I was listening and meant I got the wrong results. So kind of broadening that out to anybody listening to this, if you want to mess around with mastering, it's really important that the system that you're mastering on and listening to is as neutral as possible. Interesting thing about mastering speakers is they don't sound super bassy or super trebly. They actually sound quite bland in and of themselves. In the studio, people have speakers that give you a great vibe and that sound exciting and get everybody kind of dancing and all the rest of it. Mastering monitors are really super accurate, super flat. And the same thing applies to the converters and everything else that you use. And that means that when you get it to sound right on that very high quality but very neutral, so kind of average sounding system, then if you take and listen to it, say, like a pair of Beats headphones, Beats have huge bass on them.
Yes.
Right? That's going to sound right because people are used to listening to stuff on those headphones. They're going to expect it to have that hump in the bass end. So it's going to sound right. If you play it on a little smartphone speaker or a TV speaker or whatever, those are going to have limited frequency response. They're going to sound pretty tinny and harsh, but that's going to sound as people would expect it. Whereas if you have a system where you want to put in more bass than you would otherwise do, when you take it and listen to that on the Beats, it might sound okay on the earbuds and the TV speaker, but you listen to it on the Beats and it'll sound absurd because there's extra bass in the master and there's extra bass in the headphones as well, and it'll just sound wrong. So it's all about making sure that your monitoring system is as neutral as possible, because that's the key to translation. That and getting balanced EQ, balanced loudness, and choose your settings on a neutral system. And that's why room treatment, acoustic treatment is so important as well if you're going to try mastering your own stuff. If you have a room with no acoustic treatment, your speakers could be great, but you might not be hearing enough bass at your mastering or mixing position just because of the way the sound cancels out and adds up in the room. And that can colour what you hear and therefore the results that you get as well. So that's why I say mastering is kind of complicated, Who cares which EQ you're using and all the rest of it? There are so many parts of the chain that you want to get right. So it is hard, but it's not. Well, I say complicated. There's lots of bits to get right, but it's fairly straightforward. You can learn it yourself. I don't want to discourage anybody from listening to this from having a go, because it's a great thing to, like I say, I found it really fascinating and satisfying to do. But it's not easy. So if you're serious about wanting to do it, you're going to have to put in some serious hours to get up to speed.
Absolutely. Ian, I wanted to thank you so much for joining me today and really sharing your knowledge and expertise. It's been wonderful.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thanks for asking me.
And if you'd like to learn more from Ian and see what he's got going on, do check out his website, productionadvice.co.uk. And he also has a lot of great things going on, and we'll be sure to include links to that in the show notes. So thank you so much for listening today. And as a reminder, for links and information about today's show and our guests, please check out our show notes at audioskills.com/podcast.
Ready to go even deeper with your recording, mixing, and music production? We've got all the info and techniques you need in one place so you can turn it up. Go to audioskills.com and access a huge library of video tutorials and private workshops so you make progress even faster. Come back next week for a brand new episode of the Audio Skills Podcast.